Today we're diving into a story about a reign of terror that absolutely gripped a community for years. It's a story about just an agonizingly long wait for justice. And really, it's about what it means when, after almost 4 decades, that final, painful chapter finally closes. Take a look at this date, December 18th, 2025. Now, for the families of 5 victims, this day was nearly 40 years in the making. It was this single moment that marked the end of an impossibly long and painful journey.
Execution carried out. That's it. 3 simple words from the state of Florida, and the life of Frank Athen Walls was over. But hearing that immediately brings up a huge question, right? How do we even get here? How does it take nearly 4 decades for justice to finally be delivered? Well, to really get it, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning.
So let's rewind the clock to the mid-1980s. We're in the Florida Panhandle, and this is where a teenager, a kid named Frank Athen Walls, started a killing spree that would just leave a trail of shattered lives and a whole community living in fear. This timeline really maps out a 2-year period of just escalating terror. I mean, look at the progression here. From March of '85 to July of '87, 5 people were murdered. And these weren't just random disconnected acts. This was an escalating pattern of violence that showed a true predator at work.
And it's so important to remember that these were not just names on a case file. They were people. They had families. They had futures. They were mothers, daughters, a U.S. airman, lives that were just brutally, senselessly cut short. So let's take a moment to remember exactly who they were.
His first victim was just 19 years old, Tommy Lou Whiddon. She was simply sunbathing on an island when Walls attacked her, slitting her throat. And the sheer audacity of this crime is just chilling. Get this. At the time, Walls was supposed to be performing community service for animal cruelty and voyeurism, a punishment that he literally turned into an opportunity for murder. And the violence just kept going. Cynthia Sue Condra, a 24-year-old mother of 3, was stabbed 21 times. In his confession, Walls just said he snapped. Then you have Audrey Guy, a 47-year-old mother and grandmother, murdered in her own home, the one place she should have felt safe. Both left behind children who would have to grow up without their moms. And then came the crime that made him infamous. U.S. Airman Edward Alger and his girlfriend Ann Louise Peterson ambushed in their own home. The brutality was just shocking. Alger's throat was slashed, and both of them were shot. But it's what Walls did next that tells you everything you need to know about his chilling indifference. He stole their money, and within an hour of the murders, he was spending it at a strip club. So, Walls was arrested, and he was sentenced to death in 1988. But that wasn't the end. It was really the beginning of a whole new kind of agony for the families. The decades-long wait for justice. A road that would just stretch on and on for nearly 4 decades. 37. Just think about that number for a second. 37 years. That single number represents almost 4 decades of appeals, courtroom battles, and endless delays. 37 years for these families to wait, wondering if the sentence would ever actually be carried out. I mean, can you imagine living with that kind of uncertainty for most of your life?
So why on earth did it take so long? Well, the legal system, especially for capital punishment cases, is designed to be incredibly meticulous, and that just creates these huge delays. His first conviction, it was overturned on appeal. He was convicted and sentenced to death again in 1992, but that just started the clock on a mandatory, super-layered appeals process that wound its way through both state and federal courts for decades. But look, it's really important to understand that through all of this legal maneuvering, his guilt was never seriously in doubt. The evidence against him was described as, quote, overwhelming. And beyond that, his own confessions to these horrific crimes had already sealed his fate. The wait wasn't about guilt or innocence, it was all about the process.
In that long, winding process finally led back to this one moment. December 18th, 2025. Frank Athen Walls, now 58 years old, was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. The final act of this nearly 40-year drama was about to play out.
Before the end, he was given the chance to make a final statement, and addressing the families of his victims, he said this: "I am sorry for all of the things I did, the pain I caused, and all that you have suffered all these years. An apology delivered at the very last possible moment for a lifetime of pain he caused."
And then, just like that, it was over. After 37 years of waiting, the end came in just 11 minutes. The lethal injection began at 6 p.m., and by 6:11, Frank Athen Walls was pronounced dead. The contrast between decades of waiting and the swiftness of those final moments it's just staggering.
To put this into a bit of a bigger picture, Walls' execution was the 19th carried out by Florida in 2025, which was actually a record year for the state. His case, one of the longest in the state's history, finally came to a close during a year that saw the justice system there moving at a really unprecedented pace.
So what about the families of Tommy Lou Whidden, Cynthia Sue Condra, Audrey Gidgey, Edward Alger, and Ann Peterson? For them, this moment, it wasn't about celebration. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. It was the final page finally being turned on a nightmare that had haunted them for almost 40 years.
And that leaves us with this final question, doesn't it? Nothing can ever bring back the lives that were stolen or erase the horror of what happened, but for those left behind after a lifetime of waiting, can the final delivery of justice, no matter how delayed, provide some sense of peace? Can it finally, truly bring closure?